Thank you. Please be seated. I think we have Professor Hayward. Thank you. Would you come forward, please? Thank you. Would you just give us your full name for the record, please?
Yes, Colleen Patricia Hayward.
And do you wish to affirm or swear an oath?
Affirm, please. I, Colleen Patricia Hayward, sincerely declare and affirm that the evidence that I give to this Commission shall be the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth.
Thank you, Mr. Hayward. Would you sit down? Thank you. Mr. Sadler.
Thank you, Commissioners. Professor Hayward, were you summoned to appear before the Perth Casino Royal Commission today?
Yes.
And the Commission provided with that summons a list of topics which will be covered during your examination?
Yes.
And the Commission invited you to prepare a written statement in relation to those topics?
Yes.
And do you have a copy of that statement which you prepared?
I do.
And have you read the contents of that statement?
Yes.
And are the contents true and correct to the best of your knowledge and belief?
They are.
Thank you, Professor Hayward. Commissioners, I tender the witness statement of Professor Colleen Patricia Hayward, AM, dated 12 May 2021, which has the number GWC 0003.004.001.
Professor Hayward's witness statement will be admitted into evidence as an exhibit. Thank you. Now, Mr. Futrell.
Please, Commissioners. So I'm somewhat slightly taller than being here. I'll have to just adjust the height. Thank you, Professor Hayward. I'm going to take you through some of the topics that have been referred to in your statement and ask you to expand on some of them and clarify some of them. I might go a bit beyond those topics as well, but that'll be the general nature of the questions I have for you. So if I could just start by referring you to your statement and paragraph 4 of it, which is you dealing with your qualifications. Do I take it from that for the early part of your career you were a teacher? Is that?
It is correct.
And at what point in time did you continue teaching for a period of time? When did that conclude?
Towards the end of 1985.
And then what did you do after that?
Having taken long service leave, I then started employment with the State School Teachers Union of Western Australia.
So you worked with the union for how long were you in that role?
In and out for about 10 years.
And then you did a Bachelor of Applied Science in 1991?
Yes.
And was that part of your part of the work you were doing in the union, or was it for a change of career at that point?
It was really just because the course looked interesting and I liked to learn.
Okay. And did you continue with the union from then on, or what was the next stage?
I went back into the union for 1990, 91, 92 and 93. And then it was either 94 or 95 when I left there, probably 95, I think. And thereafter worked with part-time with the Perth Aboriginal Medical Service and the Aboriginal Legal Service.
I see, and then you undertook a postgraduate certificate in cross-sector partnerships in 2008 at
Yes.
Cambridge University. What's that course involved?
Essentially, it's looking at how otherwise disparate groups come together for a common goal. So generally the disparate groups comprise government, corporate and not-for-profit. And because they all come from a different interest base, getting the dynamics right between those parties is important if anything is going to be achieved out of any project work.
I see. And you've been on a number of boards of various organisations, including the just trying to find the Government Employers Superannuation Board from 1990 to 1996.
Yes.
And was that position as a consequence of your involvement in the union movement, or was it?
It was. I was a member's rep on the Government Employees Superannuation Board. So that was a position that was nominated through the then Trades and Labour Council, now Unions WA.
I see. And in your statement, you've said that other than the experience you gained during your time as a member of the GWC, you have no specific qualifications or experience relating to the regulation and oversight of casino and casino gambling. Do I take it from that the only experience you've received, or in respect to that, is since you have been appointed or were appointed as a member of the GWC?
It is. I hesitate because you will note there that I'm also a member of the Fremantle Football Club, and part of the AFL accreditation is a series of modules in terms of what players and officials are and are not allowed to do under that umbrella, and that includes gambling.
I see. And an element of regulation of the football
Yes.
industry as well?
Yes.
Okay, now, are you familiar, or were you familiar with the qualifications and experience of the other members of the GWC for the time you are a member?
No, other than what people may have raised anecdotally. For instance, I knew that one of the now former commissioners was a retired police officer, but that was something that only came up in conversation, not anything that was normally privy to us as members of the commission.
All right, now just I'm referring to GWC.
Yes,
You
that
understand
commission.
what I
Yeah.
mean by that?
Yep.
It's to avoid the possible
Yes.
confusion. I'm talking about two commissions here. Now, at the time of your appointment as a member of the GWC, that I think was in 2006.
Yes.
Were you aware at that point in time of any specific gap in the skills of the members of the GWC you were intended to fill?
No. No.
Do you understand your appointment was made because, I think in your words you described it as you were community-minded and you had experience on a number of other boards?
That's my understanding.
All right. Did you consider that you could bring your knowledge and experience of appropriate board governance practices to the GWC?
Absolutely.
Now, in paragraph 12 of your statement, you have referred to the training occurring, you describe it as on the job. What exactly do you mean by that?
For me, I think just about every meeting had an element of training included, with that being as we talked through the nuances of a particular paper that was part of that agenda. There was also some, what I refer to as on-the-job training, where at various times the Commission, the GWC, attended Crown to have a look at particular facilities and workings.
All right. I want to get a sense of how the meetings, generally ran. I'm not expecting to remember every single meeting, but take that in two parts. So you mentioned that when there was a report to the committee, to the GWC, there was an element of on-the-job training in respect of that. Do you mean by that members of the committee were asking questions of the person whose report it was?
Absolutely.
And receiving answers? And were those questions about the way in which the person who prepared the report was undertaking their regulatory tasks?
Some of it was. Lots of it was about the actual content of the particular paper, whether or not it made sense, whether there was sufficient background for the GWC to be able to make a decision.
And to whom were the questions directed? Were they always, these papers presented typically by the author, or was there someone else who provided the answers to your questions?
There was a bit of a mix. Generally, the questions went to the chair of that meeting. But I also recall a period of time when authors of papers especially ones that were really detailed, would attend the meeting to be able to answer questions directly.
I see. When you've mentioned in your statement also there was a lot of experience on the board, and in that context, meaning to do with the regulation of casinos. And you've mentioned three people in particular, Mr. Sargent, Mr. Ord and Mr. Connolly. Are they the people you're referring to only when it comes to people with experience on the board, or are there other members you mean by that?
They were the three main ones. Sometimes I think that depending on the memory of people at the table, for instance, some other people around the GWC table might have seen me in that light if we were referring to an issue that was still in my period as a commissioner, and I could give the background to a particular issue. So, but generally, it was Mr. Sargent, Mr. Ord and Mr. Connolly.
I see. And they obviously they were each. You understood each of them to be employees of the relevant department.
Yes.
Were there any members of the board that you considered to have experience that were not department employees?
In my view, that depended on the issue at hand. There would be people who had particular expertise from their other involvements over time, but that was much less regular.
Okay. Now, I want to go back to your answer to an earlier question where you mentioned there were, I think you said visits to the casino.
Yes.
Approximately how many of those visits do you think there would have been during your quite long period on the GWC?
Once again, depending on what issues were at hand, then we might go more often, but I think over that period it wouldn't have been even once a year.
I see. And what was the nature of the visits you undertook? What were you doing at the casino?
Generally, having a look at whatever new developments. For instance, as new games were being introduced, we specifically had a look at the training room where people who would be handling those games were trained to make sure that they knew the rules, were doing the right thing. So that was one element. There was another element where lots of the security was automated in terms of the security cameras that were introduced. We went and had a look at that as well. There were other instances, but they are two that spring to mind.
Were there any occasions when you observed the government inspectors undertaking their tasks of surveying or monitoring the activities on the floor of the casino?
Not that I can recall.
Now, I think we may have touched on this a little earlier, but you've mentioned in paragraph 24 of your statement that there were times when you asked for further information and the GWC would have the department research the matter and come back to the members. And in that context, you've also indicated that there's a lot of knowledge and expertise provided by Mr. Sargent and Mr. Connolly. Would it be fair to say that essentially all the knowledge of the manner in which gaming and casino going was and should be regulated in Western Australia came to you as a committee member as a commissioner through the department employees who were either on the GWC or employees of the department?
Yes, that's true.
You've also indicated that your view of the way that the GWC operated was that people played to their strengths. You've used that expression in your statement. And you've nominated that your strength you brought was rigour and a value mindset. Can you just explain what you mean by those two? I mean, rigour I understand, but can you just explain what you, in the context of your role, what you mean by those?
An example for me is that if we didn't have community mindedness in the mix and it was strictly regulation, there would be no such thing as responsible service of gambling. That's an add-on to what happens on the main floor that is very much about people as opposed to profit.
Can you just explain that in a little more detail? Are you suggesting that if there were not a community-minded person on the GWC, then it would simply be a case of, does the game operate fairly? Can you collect the correct revenue and that would be approved? But you were looking at it from a different perspective. From
that perspective as well as, yes.
And so what's an example of where you would involve your community mindedness in reviewing a game?
Some of that was about the speed of games and how much, I guess, a person on an unlucky day could spend. The faster the game, obviously, if they were insistent on staying there and playing more, potentially the more they could lose. So one of the things that the GWC was particularly mindful of was speed of games, the lapse between games, so that if a punter, for want of a better word, it gave them breathing space to think about whether or not they wanted to stay playing or walk away.
Is this in connection with what I might term problem gambling? Is that or is something else you're referring to?
I think it's, definitely about problem gambling. One of the disappointing things is that lots of people that we or I might classify as a problem gambler, that particular person might not classify themselves as. So some of it is about trying to help people who may not otherwise be in a position to help themselves.
And what steps did you take in order to assess gains from that perspective of community interest you've just described?
So the speed of games example.
Just looking at the game, what elements are you looking for to protect the community interest?
I'm not sure that I'm understanding the question.
You've mentioned the speed of the game. How were you able to identify the speed of the game?
We got reports on how that on how that was actually played out. We also there was an external, I suppose, veracity check in terms of whether that was right. So it wasn't either the department or the GWC or the casino saying the speed of the game is X. That was actually verified by an external and independent assessor in terms of that. Sometimes if there was a particular game where we wanted that information, we would ask for it specifically and that would be detailed and come back to us.
And was there, to your knowledge, was there any specific policy set by the GWC regarding matters such as the speed of games, or that they should meet certain criteria against which the department officers were to assess them?
There were decisions made and to my knowledge carried out, but I didn't ever see a policy manual per se.
When you say decisions made and carried out, what are you referring to there?
GWC decisions.
So after a decision had been made by the GWC, you're saying it was carried out? Is that what you mean by decisions made?
If a paper came to us and we made a decision, you expect that decision is going to be implemented.
Yes.
Is that what you're asking?
But how did you check to see that? How did you verify that it had been implemented after the decision was made?
Sometimes we ask for progress reports in 6 months' time or in 12 months' time, depending on the issue. so that we could actually do that check ourselves.
I see. When you say it wasn't a policy manual or anything of that nature, was there any way in which you collected, for example, prior decisions on things you've just been describing, as in the type of games in a central repository you could review?
Not by the GWC.
Do you know if it was done by the department?
I don't know with any certainty.
Were there any occasions when you sought the assistance of a third party, when we by third party, a non-departmental person or a non-member of the GWC to assist you with your functions on the GWC?
The main one was that example that I just used, in terms of there being an external independent check of the operations of a game, such as the speed of the game.
And who engaged that? Who was first of all, who was the person you engaged? Do you remember?
I don't.
It was a third party consultant of some sort, was it?
Yes, it was an organisation, a firm.
And was that organisation engaged directly by the GWC, or was it some other process?
I'm not certain.
And who do you know who requested the advice be sought from the third party?
That was a regular process. That was part of having the games approved.
I see. Would that process have been undertaken by the department first, or at the first instance, or someone within the GWC? But when you're approving a game, what was the? Perhaps we start with the game. A new game is sought to be approved.
Mm-hmm.
Who had responsibility for reviewing the game, and making the recommendation to the GWC?
Representatives from Crown would present to the GWC. They would demonstrate how the game would work, and from that point, the GWC either withheld approval or approved in principle.
When you say the GWC, do you mean directly to the members of the GWC, or via a person who was employed by the department first? In other words, did people from Crown visit or make presentations directly to the GWC?
Yes.
And was that the point at which you considered you were then making a decision to approve it or not approve a new game?
Not while representatives from the casino were in the room. That was something we did as the GWC in our own right.
And was there typically a paper prepared by someone from the department before or after the presentation by Crown?
Often before.
And in that paper, was there an assessment undertaken of the games by a departmental person?
That's my recollection.
And so when the third party was involved, was that then at the request of the GWC first, or did it come to you, if you like, pre-packaged, having already been obtained by someone from the department?
I think it followed. Our approval was only ever in principle. I mean, you don't have a business go off and produce or manufacture 10 machines, for instance, only to then find that approval is not there. So for any of that manufacture, you actually need at least in principle support to be able to expend that money. That's just business principles. Part of what then came forward for final approval included that additional information of the external testing.
I see. And just, was it your understanding that the external person was engaged by someone within the GWC itself, or was it a department person?
That's the same question as before, and I still don't remember.
No, okay, that's it's not a memory test. That's fine. Okay, now you've mentioned in paragraph 34 of your statement that recommendations were made by people within the department and they were not always accepted. Are you able to provide an example of a circumstance where a recommendation was not accepted?
I know there were some. I couldn't point to a specific one.
And just talking in generalities, then, if it wasn't accepted, what would typically be the procedure after a recommendation was not accepted? Would it be returned to the department for further consideration, or was it the end of the matter from your perspective?
It depended on the issue at hand. While I can't come to specifics, there are some where the board made a decision and it wasn't just to not accept the recommendation that had come forward. We went with a different decision, and there were some instances where it was referred back to the department for additional information to come forward.
I see. And so I just moved a slightly different topic, if you don't mind. I did have another question, but I think I'll leave it for now. Can I ask you to turn to paragraph 22 of your statement? And turning now to the materials that you received when you were first appointed as a member of the GWC, and I guess materials you received over the course of the time you were a member. Now, you've said you were provided with a copy of the Gaming and Wagering Commission Act, and at some point you received a document, publication of the Public Sector Commission, which is the Board Essentials document. Do you recall whether you were provided with other regulations and acts that are dealt with by the GWC?
I can't recall specifically.
Did you become familiar with the acts over the course of your time as a member of the GWC?
Both the Act and the regulations, and I'll clarify, linked to the previous question, when board papers came to the GWC, they included background which referenced specific clauses in the Act and specific regulations that were pertinent to that matter.
Did you understand that as part of your function was the regulation under the Casino Controls Act as well as the Gaming and Wagering Commission Act?
Yes.
And the regulations under the Casino Control Act as well?
Yes.
Were you familiar at the time with the state agreement between the state and the licensee of the Perth Casino?
I don't recall that.
You were not made familiar with the...
I don't recall that.
You don't recall whether you were or you weren't? You can't say one way or the other?
That's right.
Okay. Were you provided... were you aware of the existence of something that's referred to as the Casino Operations Manual?
That sounds familiar, but once again, I can't be certain.
Okay. Are you familiar with the powers that the GWC could exercise under the Casino Control Act regarding the regulation of the Perth Casino?
Once again, it would depend on the matter that was at hand and the information that came forward to the GWC in making our decision.
Okay. Do you recall whether there were any occasions when a recommendation was made that the GWC give a direction to the licensee of the Perth Casino?
I'm not sure if this example fits in that context, but one that springs to mind is the amount of money that could be held in the escrow account.
And that's the escrow account of the...
Of the casino, yes.
And you think there may be a direction was made regarding the amount that can be held in that account?
I know there was a direction made. Whether that falls under the regs is what I'm not certain of.
I see. But there was a recommendation made that the GWC make a direction, and so far as you can recall, that recommendation was accepted and the direction was made.
Yes.
Were you provided at any time with any document that set out or summarised the various powers of the GWC under the various pieces of legislation it's relevant to the exercise of its functions?
I don't recall that.
When you say don't recall, do you mean you don't remember, or you have a positive recollection you did not receive one?
I don't recall.
one way or the other.
That's right.
When you were provided with that publication, the Public Sector Commission's Board Essentials, did you familiarise yourself with it?
Yes.
And are you still familiar with it?
Yes.
And are you familiar with the instructions that the Public Sector Commissioner also issues from time to time?
If they're circulated to us, I always took them seriously.
You would be aware of the instruction concerning a code of conduct, for example?
Yes.
And do you recall whether the GWC itself had a code of conduct?
No, I don't recall.
Perhaps if I could ask that document GWC .0002.0016.0122 be called up. This is this document, Professor Hayward, is an agenda paper for a meeting. I personally recognising my face, I'm afraid. A meeting on the 25th of November 2014. Can I ask if the witness could be shown page 0173 of this document? Now, if you just have a consider that document and ask you if it's refreshed your memory at all regarding the previous question I asked.
I can see that it's there, but
you don't remember.
No.
Whilst you were a member of the GWC, do you recall if there was any document provided to the GWC which is referred to as a statement of expectations from the minister, the responsible minister?
No, I don't recall.
Are you familiar with what I'm talking about? The document that's referred to within the public sector as a statement of expectations? You're unaware of it?
Unaware.
Are you aware of a document referred to as a statement of intent that government agencies provide from time to time in response to ministerial statements of expectation?
No.
At any time while you're a member of the GWC, were you provided with a document referred to as a charter of the members?
Not that I can recall.
Was there a document referred to as a charter developed at any time during the period you were a member of the GWC?
Still don't recall.
Don't recall. Well, was there a document then that you were aware of that set out matters such as the role, composition and processes related to the key governance activities of the GWC, or a series of documents of that kind?
I don't know if I'm thinking about what you're asking. Could you reword? So you're talking about almost a skills matrix of the GWC.
Well, that might be a way of describing it. It's just a document that would set out, so for example, for a new member or existing members, a document that would identify for them in one place an explanation of your role, the functions of the GWC and the processes that relate to its key governance criteria.
I don't recall that in regard to me. I don't know what followed in terms of other members of the commission, of the GWC as they came on board. I can't speak to that.
Okay, again, I just want to clarify, you say you don't recall, you don't remember receiving one yourself at the time you became a member?
That's right.
And are you saying that you didn't receive one, or you just don't know if you did or you didn't?
I don't remember receiving one.
And do you remember if there was a document of that kind developed during the course of your tenure as a member of the committee, of the commission?
Not that came to the GWC as a body, just reinforcing, I don't know, there may well have been something developed where a new member of the commission was given that specifically at the time of their appointment, but because I was already on, it wouldn't have related to me.
Okay, but what I'm asking you, there wasn't any meeting that you can recall at which the GWC discussed, for example, it's a good idea that new members receive a document of that character, something that sets out gives them an explanation of what their function is as a member. They should be provided it because for example, you didn't receive one, it'd be a good idea if others receive it. There was nothing of that kind that you can recall?
No, not that I can recall.
All right, now at any time while you're a member of the GWC, were you provided with a document that might be characterised as a risk management policy and practices of the GWC?
So risk management of the GWC.
Yes, so and it may not have been called that, but a document or a process that governed, from the GWC's perspective, identification of risks and the way in which you were to manage the risks identified.
I don't recall anything like that about the operations of the GWC. I can remember there being a paper on risk, just over 12 months ago that was presented by Crown in terms of their assessment of their risk as we headed into COVID. But that's not about the risks of the operations of the GWC. So
Yes,
is that what you're asking?
I'm asking you, I'm not concerned at the moment with Crown's identification of its risks. I'm talking about the GWC itself. Was there a time at which, at any time you can remember during your period as a member, where there was a process undertaken to identify risks specific to the GWC's functions and a process then undertaken to manage those risks?
I don't recall a specific paper. I do recall conversations when the membership of the GWC was less, because we always had to ensure that meetings were quorate. But that wasn't in terms of a paper.
Okay. So if ask if I could ask if the widths could be shown. It's still in the same document, page 0218. Might assist to address, just to direct your attention to some. If you really, what I'm asking you about, this is taken from the public sector public sector commissioner's document, the Board Essentials.
Mm-hmm.
I'm asking you really about whether there were occasions when the key questions that you can see under that start on the fourth paragraph from a governance perspective. There are 3 bullet points there. Whether there were occasions when those were specifically the subject of any deliberations of the GWC that you can remember.
Not specific consideration.
And when you say not specific, are you meaning to say they were considered in passing when other decisions were being made, or are you saying there wasn't a separate meeting or a separate occasion when you sat down as a commission and considered it across the entire organisation?
In my view, those questions were answered in terms of people's behaviour and the behaviour of the GWC, not a specific, let's answer that question, now let's answer the next one and then the next one.
Okay. Really what I'm asking about though is whether there was a point in time at which the GWC thought, well, it would be a good idea to prepare some formal documentation of what our risks are and our process for managing them. I think you've probably already answered that question by saying you can't recall that taking place.
I can't recall.
And some of the other document, the heading a little further down, so from a compliance perspective, in terms of managing risks, were there occasions when you considered whether you could, as an organisation, answer that question?
That came about from the detail included in the board paper.
When you say board, like each board paper, so you would consider that I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think I'm trying to answer the question for you. You were considering those things in the context of specific items on the board agenda. Is that
That's my understanding.
Rather than looking at it in global.
Yes.
Along a similar vein, were there any times while you're a member of the GWC where either in a meeting or in a separate session there was a consideration given to the various skill set across the membership and whether you had any gaps in that skill set?
I don't recall ever having any formal consideration of a skills matrix for members of the GWC.
When you say no formal consideration of a skills matrix, was there any informal discussions of that kind that you can remember?
Not in the specifics that I understand. That consideration happens with other boards.
Yeah, so you're talking now of your experience on other probably larger boards with larger organisations, presumably, where there is a skill matrix process. You're familiar with that process?
And a regular review.
And a regular review at intervals of approximately once a year or once every 2 years perhaps?
Yes.
Where the board would sit down and say, what are our collective skills? Do we have all the skills we need to perform our functions?
Yes.
And are you saying nothing of that character happened while you were a member of the GWC?
Not that I can recall.
When there were changes to the composition of the membership from time to time while you were a member, and I just want you to ask these questions in the general, and you can answer them in that way. When there was a change to membership, was there any process at that time by which consideration was given, these are the skills that are leaving the organisation, what do we need? What sort of person do we need to come in to replace them?
The GWC was not involved in either communicating the skills that we thought were leaving or that we thought needed to come in. We were not part of that process.
Was there any consideration that you can recall given to that question while you were on a member?
Not by the GWC.
Did you give a consideration to it yourself?
In my head.
You don't recall voicing it?
Conversations would have only been casual about, gee, wouldn't it be good if? There was no formal process.
And who would those conversations have taken place? Was this in the context of a meeting or with the chair or with someone else?
Yeah, in the context of a meeting. I can remember there being a conversation like that when I was leaving, for instance.
Right. But so far as you can recall, there was no
formal
deliberate
process.
Decision-making process employed for that?
No.
Okay. Now, while you were a member, again, I'm going to ask you this in a general sense. either in a specific meeting or during the course of your regular meetings, was there any discussion or deliberation on developing a strategic plan for the GWC?
I can't recall a specific conversation.
To the best of your knowledge, was there a strategy of the GWC?
Not that I can recall.
So there wasn't, in your mind, as when you were sitting making decisions for the GWC, there wasn't a clear view in your mind of what the strategy of the GWC was against which you were making decisions?
No, nothing was framed that I can recall. Nothing was framed in terms of a strategic plan. Okay,
so I'm referring now to perhaps a document, something that was documented, so a strategic plan document. Was there some informal sense in which you considered as a collective you understood a strategy that was being followed by the GWC?
I don't think so. I think as matters presented and needed to be dealt with, they were dealt with. My experience in other organisations where there is a deliberate strategic plan is that you seek particular opportunities that help you meet that strategy. The work of the GWC was different to that in my view.
Okay, I want to explore that with you, if you don't mind. So to start with, there's in other organisations that you are involved in, there is something you understand to be a strategic plan.
Yep.
And would it be fair to say that when decisions are being made in those organisations, they are usually measured against the strategic plan? How does this fit in with our overall strategy?
Yes.
And that is one of the factors taken into account when you're deciding whether to take a particular step or prove a particular thing.
Yes.
If there is no plan of that nature, when a decision comes to be made, there's nothing to guide you in that sense of is it part of our overall strategy. So are you saying that in the context of the GWC, decisions were made on a more ad hoc basis without any clear idea of the direction or strategy of the organisation?
I don't know that I would say that. Ad hoc makes it sound like it's not a deliberate consideration. Which is why I said if something needed to be attended to, the GWC did its best to attend to it. Now, you wouldn't always be able to predict what those things were. It's the agenda for this particular agenda that's on the screen now, for instance, has got the MS Super Lottery. That was a totally different concept here in WA. It's great now, but there was a lot of risk that the GWC identified for the fundraisers of that particular lottery when it first came up. It's proven to be successful, and lots of other organisations have tried to copy it, but you couldn't in a strat plan have predicted that something like that would come forward, and yet it still needed to be dealt with. So I'm hesitant about ad hoc because that sounds like it's kind of almost a fly in the ointment. It's almost an aside, and things I think were more deliberate than that.
I didn't mean to infer there wasn't deliberate consideration of the matters that came before the GWC at all. So I wasn't in any way intending to be pejorative by using the expression ad hoc. I was simply meaning it was a decision made on a case-by-case basis rather than considering the decision against an overall strategy of the GWC.
Yes, I can definitely agree with that.
So taking the example you've just given of the MSC, for example, it would not be necessarily directly in view for the GWC when it was developing, if it had developed a strategic plan, but it may fit in with an overall view of the GWC of what the regulation of gaming in Western Australia might look like in the future.
Indeed. But that's not a strat plan.
Okay, well, with an organisation such as the GWC, would you agree that it would be useful to consider overall what view the GWC should take of, say, for example, risks associated with gambling, and have a clear idea of what, if you like, tolerance of risk there may be for the GWC as a whole?
We certainly considered the risks associated with problem gambling.
Okay, so problem gambling is one possible risk. One can think of other risks that are associated with the operation of a casino gaming. For example, whether the machines are correctly calibrated, whether the revenue is derived and returned to the state. Was there consideration of any other kinds of risks associated with the operation of the casino in particular?
Once again, I'm not too sure if I'm answering the question you're asking. The prospect of a minor being allowed onto the floor is a risk. The prospect of people after a night out getting into an altercation in the car park is a risk. You've mentioned the calibration of machines, the return to player. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question.
You are in part. What I'm considering is when you said it wasn't a strategic plan, management of risks associated with the regulation. What I'm putting to you is that management of risks associated with the regulation of the casino in particular is something that could fit in to a strategic plan of the GWC. How it will approach the management of those risks.
Certainly it could.
And
if there was a strategic plan.
if there was yes. Can I just take you to another page in this document, which is starts at page 231. It might be easier if I hand you a paper copy of this. I don't know if the commissioners have got this. This is Appendix D, headed Good Governance Principles. I'll just ask you to take a moment to read through it.
Okay. Is there a particular bit?
What I'd ask you to focus on are the seven major headings, and then the questions under quick probe under each heading, just to familiarise yourself with the document.
It'll be easier for me to reference when you make a specific...
Oh, okay. Well the first consideration, I have here is obviously the GWC was aware of the existence of the good governance principles or the Public Sector Commissioner's document that this appears in, which is I forgot the name of it momentarily, the
Good governance principles.
Board Essentials. Sorry, thank you. Board Essentials. Was there any occasion at which you can recall the GWC approaching its governance by reference to the good governance principles and looking through each of these and asking itself the question of whether these principles were met?
I don't recall us doing that.
would you agree with me that in respect of item 1, there wasn't clarity regarding the roles and responsibilities of the board, individual members? I'd say here, rather than the CEO, the chief casino officer and the minister, in terms of providing some sort of form of documentation.
Well, I don't understand what you're asking.
Well, in your view, was there clarity in your mind about the roles and responsibilities of the board, its individual members, and the chief casino officer and the minister?
I can only answer from the perspective of the GWC. Is that what you're
Yes,
asking?
I'm asking you from your perspective as a member of the GWC, in your mind, was there clarity about those things?
Whether or not we understood our roles and responsibilities, yes, I think we did.
Okay, and what did you understand your role and responsibilities as a GWC to be?
Knowing that a piece of string has no length, my answer will also have no length. It's about dealing with anything that came before it. It's about raising any matters that you saw or heard in the news. It's about if a matter contained in a paper warranted further question. It's anything that was before the GWC. I don't think that's what you're asking, but I don't actually know what you're asking.
You're quite right. It was a bit of an open-ended question. I'll come back to asking some more specific questions about role and responsibility in a moment, because you've answered the question. You said you think you had a clear understanding of that. I'll come back to ask you some specific questions about that.
Yep.
What about item 2? In your view, did the members have the necessary skills, experience and knowledge to enable the board to collectively fulfil its role?
We did fulfil our role, so the answer must be yes.
Okay, but I'm asking you whether you felt during your time as a member that all the necessary skills to fulfil the functions were on the membership of the GWC.
We didn't ever do a skills matrix. So what I considered, as a person, what I considered to be skills attributable to any other member of the GWC or the GWC collectively were only what I, as an individual, considered. We didn't do a skills matrix.
So without undertaking, I mean, obviously there are limits to the utility of conducting a formal process, but without conducting or turning your mind formally to the process, how could you be satisfied that you had the required skill set on the GWC at the time?
The GWC couldn't.
Could not be so satisfied?
We had no input to what skills were coming to the GWC.
Would it not be something you could make a request to the minister to appoint someone to the committee to fill a gap, for example?
It's not the usual way that one deals with a minister. I've never experienced that where you question a minister about cabinet decisions about who would be on a commission or board.
No, I'm not suggesting that you'd question the decision that was made. I'm suggesting that you could request, let's say, for example, there was an identified, this is a hypothetical, shortage in a particular skill on the GWC, you could ask that a further person be appointed to fill that gap, could you not?
I don't think that ever happened from the GWC. I also don't think it ever happened with any other government boards with which I have experience.
What other government boards are you referring to there?
Government Employee Superannuation Board, the State Training Board, currently the Alcohol and Other Drugs Advisory Board.
So you're saying, in your experience, none of those government boards have...
Generally,
identified-
you are advised of the decision of Cabinet. You don't ever see what paper went forward to Cabinet.
But what I'm suggesting to you is you could actually request that a decision be made to fill a gap in your skill set, if there were one identified on the GWC. Do you not agree with that?
I think it would be a wonderful innovation, but it would be an innovation.
And Ms Hayward, leave government bodies to one side for a moment.
Yes,
Has any of the other boards or bodies on which you've been involved had a nominations committee?
yes,
And has that worked well?
yes.
And would that be an appropriate form of advance, in your view, for a body like the GWC?
I think it could well be.
Okay, could I ask you to turn to the third topic, which is strategic focus? I did ask you some questions about this earlier. In your view, do you consider that the GWC set an overall strategic direction of the organisation?
I'm taking that in the same way as did we have a strategic plan and we didn't.
Okay. And so evidently then you couldn't monitor that against performance against intended outcomes if you didn't have such a plan.
No.
And I asked you some questions about as well, about risk management. And I want to come back to these in a bit more detail because I did ask you a very broad question. You quite rightly pointed that out to me. But this particular aspect of the governance principle is directed to process. And did you consider that there was a system of risk oversight in place on the GWC during the time you remember?
Once again, there are different facets to that. The biggest risk that was clear in terms of the working of the GWC or the GWC being able to perform its work was making sure that meetings were quorate. There was no risk information that came to us for input in terms of, for instance, the machinery of government changes and the additional pressure that that put on the department, even though we knew that that developed a risk. I've already indicated that when the casino presented to the GWC, there was it wasn't unusual for there to be risks identified by the casino in terms of bringing those matters forward. So there's different facets to it.
So can I try and paraphrase what you've just said so I'm clear on the nature of what your answer is? Are you suggesting that while there may not have been an overall system of risk identification and management, in your view, the GWC was addressing risk on a case-by-case basis as each paper was presented, or each decision was presented to it for consideration at a meeting?
My view is that it was.
And again, taking you into the private sector world that where you've sit on boards or quasi-private sector world, is it your experience in that environment that risk is normally a very significant item in any agenda paper? It identifies what the risks are associated with the decision to be made as a primary focus.
Sometimes yes. Otherwise, it might be a report from that body's audit and risk committee. And lots of other places, of course, have audit and risk committees.
Okay, so in your experience with the GWC, were the papers presented focusing on identification of risk associated with the decision to be made in your experience?
I don't know that I would say it was as clearly articulated as that, but the background presented in any particular paper coming to the GWC would include those things.
But was it not presented in a way that identified for the
There
reader?
wasn't a heading of risk.
And so would you say then that identification and management of risk was largely left to the members of the GWC itself upon reading the papers?
I think often risks were identified in the papers,
Yes.
and that allowed the GWC to explore those further.
Okay, now, to your knowledge, was there a, if I could take you to heading 5, control systems?
Mm-hmm.
In your view, was there a system in place to ensure there was a flow of information to the board that supports effective policy and coordinated decision making?
Sorry, can you ask that again?
In your view, did the GWC, I'll call it the board, which is the members as a whole, have a system in place to ensure that the flow of information to it, the board that is, supported effective policy and coordinated decision making? You've mentioned some things in your statement about the production of board papers, but I'm really focusing the question on system.
Once again, I'm not sure if I'm answering the question you're asking. The board papers came as the board papers. They were generated from the department. There were times when the GWC would ask for a paper to be developed on a specific issue, although I'd be hard-pressed to be specific around an example. But generally, we considered papers that came forward via the mechanisms within the department. Is that what you're asking?
I think this topic is more about identification of accountability to ensure that effectively what you're being presented with meets your regulatory or your statutory obligations, and that you're accountable for the decisions you make. Is there a system in place that addressed those features of decision making, to your knowledge?
I'm going to, I think, be answering a different question again.
Let's focus on the quick probe questions, for instance. Was there an audit subcommittee?
No, not of the GWC.
And was there a procedure in place for ensuring compliance with legal, financial and record keeping requirements?
The compliance with legal and financial came about from the content of the board papers. The record keeping requirements was for the department, not for the GWC.
Okay. So that function was left to the department, the record keeping.
Yes.
And were there any procedures that you had in place to ensure the record keeping was being undertaken correctly in accordance with whatever the obligations of the GWC were?
I understand there was a minute book.
Okay. I will come back to some more specific examples of this in a moment. I'll take you to the heading under question 6. This is a question about culture, and of course, it's not that easy to put your finger on it, and you can answer this at a level of impression, really. During your period as a member of the GWC, would you agree, or would you consider the board, together with the CCO and the chair, in this case, set the tone for ethical and responsible decision making through through the GWC?
Yes, I do consider that.
And what would you say about the way in which, just as a general level of impression, the board functioned in your tenure on it? Was it, in other words, was it a functioning and good board, or were there any problems that you perceived with the way it was operating?
There were examples associated with two commissioners who weren't on the GWC at the same time, so two board members, who were, in my view, consumed by a personal interest. So they pushed that barrow at every turn. That's not to say that the matters they raised ought not have been raised or considered, but that was their hobby horse.
When you say personal interest, what's the nature of the interest there are two, so I'll take them each one at a time. So the first one you have in mind, what's the nature of the personal interest you're referring to?
A former board member who had a friend who had lost their house over problem gambling, and so the question of problem gambling came up at every turn.
So there was a particular interest of that person in problem gambling?
Yes.
Because they had a particular interest in that topic, as you call it, a hobby horse?
Yes.
Okay, that's the first example. What about the second example?
The second example was from someone who had a really strong push for profits from gambling going to the community sector, to be able to financially support community organisations and the like.
So, and how, just give me an example how that would affect or be implemented through the functions of the GWC?
Well, it couldn't be, which was part of the problem. But over the 14 or 15 years, they are the only two examples that I can recall where you either wished for a different membership or could even question people's commitment to doing the best job they could.
Or wish for a stronger chair to close discussion.
Sorry?
Or wish for a stronger chair to close discussion. When things got out of hand. That's a gratuitous aside. Don't take any notice of it.
Yeah. Although it's probably right.
Just on that topic though, did you, obviously there were people who had the particular interests you've described. In your view, was that affecting the decision making of the GWC at the time as a whole?
I don't think so. I think when such matters were raised, the GWC